Hey everyone, I'm going to talk today about a classic, in a sense, that being Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. If you're not familiar with this book, a little bit on that first. In Cold Blood was published in 1966 and tells the story of a crime committed several years earlier in 1959. Many consider it to be the first example of the modern true crime novel, which is a genre I'm not particularly well versed in, but is, I suppose, somewhat adjacent to other genres that I sometimes read. The most similar book I've read would probably have been We Keep the Dead Close by Becky Cooper, which I discussed here maybe 2 to 3 years ago at this point, but that book too is really quite a bit different from this one. In Cold Blood tells the story of the apparently unprovoked murder of 4 members of the Clutter family in their rural home in Holcomb, Kansas. Being a true crime novel, it's based on actual true events, but told in a novelistic style that emphasizes fluid writing, character exploration, and deeper motivations and implications. There does appear to be a little bit of speculation, too, in telling some of the characters' narratives, but to the extent that he can, the author is clearly trying to rely on actual testimonies of characters. I mentioned this novel when I was getting started with it in my previous Friday Reads video, and there I mentioned that I wasn't really sure exactly how I felt about it or about the whole genre. This is still true even after reading it. The idea of immersing ourselves into the details of what seems, at least at first, like a totally senseless crime, and exploring the life stories of the victims and the murderers leading up to that point, is an interesting one, and surely was an innovative one at the time this novel was written. I'm not quite sure, though, where is the exact value, if any, in reading it, but in the end, I definitely did find it worthwhile. I admire the way this book is written, and I found it was captivating the whole way through while still remaining grounded. This is especially impressive for me because in some ways this novel and the genre it ushered in are built on sensationalism, and yet the sensational aspects, though present, were not the most salient part of this novel for me. One thing that troubled me towards the start of the novel, in my own reaction to it, is that the story is kind of dull at the beginning. It feels sort of inappropriate to say that about the account of an actual crime that resulted in the deaths of 4 actual people, but it's just true of the way that the story is told. For the first quarter of the book, I found myself repeatedly tugged between 2 unfavorable comparisons with other genres. As much as the author tries to get into the characters' minds without simply inventing them, the character development in this novel does feel weak compared to what we get in a literary fiction type novel, where the author actually does have the license to just invent the characters and show us everything about them. On the other hand, as a crime novel, it also feels lacking because this isn't some James Bond adventure. It's constrained by the nature of events that actually happened, some of which were interesting and others of which were rather mundane. And the novel really felt to me like it dragged towards the beginning. We're introduced to the victims, to the residents of the town, to the police officers, to the killers, and yes, we do know who the killers are from the second chapter, although it will be much longer before we really learn why the crime was committed. And this delay in exposing many of the key details about the situation and about the killers' backstories is good for creating suspense, but awkward as the beginning to the entire work. It had me repeatedly thinking, this is all fine, but why should I pay attention to this particular story more than any other story, especially one where the author can invent the narrative for himself? That still remains a valid question by the end of the book, but at that point it's at least not because the story and its characters are uninteresting. Rather, it's a question of whether it's worthwhile for us to spend our time immersing ourselves in the lives of murderers and exploring these morbid situations. Where, we might ask, is the value in this? It's awkward to call it entertainment, although that really is what it is. Maybe spectacle is a more appropriate word for this morbid fascination. And if our goal is to build deeper empathy for those around us, then is this the best context for us to do so? Where the book surprised me by the second half, though, is that this book does instill a surprising amount of empathy for the perpetrators without diminishing the pain they inflicted on their victims and on the Holcomb community. By the end, the true tragedy is not merely what happened to the Clutter family, but also that 2 human beings could have arrived at this point from which they saw it fit to kill their fellow humans in this way, from which they held such a disregard for the lives of others. By and large, the killers in this book are not portrayed as some sort of psychotic freaks, but rather as victims in their own way of a world that has constantly failed them. Not entirely victims, of course. They still have their agency in committing this crime, and they have to face the consequences for it. But victims in a certain sense of the word. For me, the true strength of this book, and why I found it worthwhile in spite of my misgivings, is that no one in the story, not even the killers, is portrayed in a way so as to truly separate or other them from the reader. As readers, we're discouraged from simply passing judgment and using the story to feel better about how we, unlike they, are good people. We're instead challenged to relate to the hardships and resentment that the killers themselves felt. To recognize these not as total anomalies, but as experiences and judgments everyone has experienced in some lesser way, even if perhaps sometimes in the context of our murder stories, these attitudes feel petty or immature or just plain delusional from our vantage point. You may finish the novel feeling these killers were bad people, but 100% bad? It'll be hard to really hold that view, and even many of the characters in the community affected by the crime seem to feel some pity for the perpetrators. This all somewhat clarifies another reason, though, that the start of the book drags, which is that despite claiming to be a book about all the people in the community, such as the victims who seem to take center role at the start, at the end of the day, this book is really a story centered on the killers and getting to know what drives them and how they view the world. Intriguingly, even by the end, as much as the author makes the attempt to get to know them, they do remain quite cryptic. On one hand, showing elements of human decency, while at the same time never really seeing what they did as wrong from a place of empathy with the victims. More, if anything, seeing it wrong in some more absolute, obsessive sort of moral sense, or seeing it as wrong in that they should have known they would get caught for it. Like, what's wrong about it is that it was not a smart crime. That's not to say, though, that the end of the book drags. I thought, actually, that once the killers were nabbed by the police, it would mostly feel like tying up loose ends for the remaining quarter or so of the book. Nevertheless, despite that we may already guess by this point how the trial is going to play out, this final quarter is quite strong, as it gives both a glimpse into the process of justice, albeit as it existed in the US 60 years ago in this particular community, and a final look at how the killers cope with the consequences and with what this crime means to their identities. I do think a little bit of additional trimming of the manuscript would have really perfected this narrative. As it is, we get some parts of the book that are either not really necessary and don't add anything. For example, there's a couple of pages about the auction of the Clutter estate right before the trial takes place, which I've kind of found besides the point, and there are many instances like this. There are also parts that are important, but they're repeating a lot of things we've already heard. For example, the criminals' own accounts of their life stories are given to us at the end of the book, which is important to hear from their own words, but these accounts contain bits of new information along with a bunch of stuff that's already been shared with us by the narrator. This latter issue is sort of a consequence of the narrative style, in which the window into these killers' backstories and motivations is continually opened just a bit wider as we progress further into the book. I won't harp on these shortcomings too much, though, because ultimately I do think this novel is well told, and I'm glad I read it. I appreciate the author's commitment to telling it in what ultimately feels to me like a very respectful manner to all parties involved. And I'm sure for those who are more into the true crime genre, it's also fascinating to examine the novel's influence on its successors. It does feel like the kind of novel where once I've read one of its kind that's really well done, I don't really need to read anything like it for quite a while. Having seen what the author shows here through this situation and through the characters here, I feel there was value in reading it, and yes, it was captivating and entertaining at times in its own different way, but I don't feel much desire now to proceed to investigate a bunch more of these grisly crimes. To me, the exact details are less interesting than this broader psychological story being told here. Have you read this one? How do you feel about it? Anything important I missed in my discussion? Almost definitely yes. Wishing you a fruitful summer of reading and of everything else, and happy reading.